Welcome back to our videos on Form 4 Biology. Today we'll be studying Chapter 3 and specifically 3.2 on movement of substances across the plasma membrane. So we'll be discussing the different types of substances that can move across the different parts of the plasma membrane, like the transport proteins here and also through the phospholipid bilayer. Here are the learning outcomes for this video. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define polar molecule and selectively permeable membrane, or sometimes called semi-permeable membrane. Secondly, be able to identify areas in the plasma membrane that are hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Thirdly, be able to state three structures in the plasma membrane that allow the molecules or ions to pass through them. Fourthly, state the characteristics of the different types of molecules that pass through the plasma membrane. Fifthly, explain why these molecules can pass through the plasma membrane. And lastly, state three types of passive transport across the plasma membrane. These types of passive transport will be discussed in the next video. In the last video, we have studied the components of the plasma membrane, which includes the phospholipid bilayer, protein molecules, glycolipids and glycoproteins, and cholesterol. In this video, we'll focus on the phospholipid bilayer and the protein molecules and their function in the transport of substances across the plasma membrane. So we'll also discuss the functions of these two types of proteins, which are channel proteins and carrier proteins. This lesson will focus on the most important characteristic of the plasma membrane, which is that it is a selectively permeable membrane, or it is semi-permeable. What does this term mean, selectively permeable? It means that this membrane only allows some substances or molecules to move across it freely, but prevents other substances from doing so. It will allow the smaller molecules or substances to move across it freely, but the bigger ones are prevented from going through. So how does it do that? Let's find out. In the previous videos, we have already discussed the structure of the phospholipid molecule, which forms the phospholipid bilayer. So a phospholipid molecule has a hydrophilic head and two hydrophobic tails. Now, the hydrophilic head is attracted to water because it is polar, meaning it has negative or positive charges. In this case, the head has negative charges due to the presence of the phosphate group. Thus, it's attracted to water, which is also a polar molecule, having positive and negative ends. So the negatively charged head will be attracted to the positively charged end of water. Thus, it's attracted to water, and the head will always face the watery environment outside, or the cytoplasm that contains water on the inside. The tails are different in that they are not charged and they are nonpolar, having no positively or negatively charged ends. So they repel water as they are different in nature, and they are called hydrophobic tails. So the tails will face inwards towards each other. So now we will discuss the characteristic of the phospholipid bilayer. The phospholipid bilayer consists of the hydrophilic heads at the top here, which face the watery environment outside, the extracellular fluid that contains water. And the lower part here are also hydrophilic heads that face the cytoplasm. In the center are the hydrophobic tails. So this is a big region called the hydrophobic core or hydrophobic region. Now this region does not allow certain substances to pass through it. Because it is non-polar, it is not charged, it repels water. So it will not allow substances that have different characteristics from it to pass through it. And these are the water-soluble molecules, polar molecules that have uneven distribution of charges like glucose, which has positive ends and negative ends, amino acids, charged ions such as sodium ions, magnesium ions. As long as they are charged, they cannot go through this hydrophobic core here. It will prevent them from passing through because the hydrophobic core is unlike the charged substances. It is non-polar and not charged. So before we go further, it is helpful for you to understand about the water molecule. Water molecule is a polar molecule with uneven distribution of charges. That's the meaning of a polar molecule. All right? It has uneven distribution of charges. So how did that occur? Now here is a picture of a water molecule, H2O. So this is the oxygen atom, and at the back are the hydrogen atoms. The oxygen atom here is very electronegative and tends to pull the electrons of hydrogen nearer to it. So that's why there is uneven distribution of charges, because when the electrons are pulled close to oxygen, causes it to become, this end to become negatively charged, whereas the hydrogen ends will become positively charged, have a partial positive charge. Right? Oxygen has a partial negative charge. Thus, water molecules tend to stick to each other and to other polar molecules which also have negative and positive ends. For example, the negative end of the water molecule here will be attracted to the positive end of another polar molecule, and vice versa. So in this way, polar molecules will attract other polar molecules. And in this way, water is considered a good solvent because it can dissolve polar molecules very well by sticking onto it. So to summarize very quickly, let's look at the differences between polar and non-polar molecules. Polar molecules have uneven distribution of charges, but non-polar molecules have even distribution of charges. Thus, polar molecules have positive poles and negative poles on their molecules, but non-polar molecules do not have these positive and negative poles. See, that's how you get this word polar from the word pole. Polar molecule means it has poles, negative and positive poles. Non-polar means it doesn't have positive and negative poles. Now, polar molecules dissolve well in water, which is also a polar molecule, polar solvent. So like dissolves like. Whereas non-polar molecules dissolve well in the non-polar solvents, similar type of solvents. Organic solvents like alcohol, for example. Examples of polar molecules are water, glucose, amino acids, salts, and hydrochloric acid. For non-polar molecule, oxygen and carbon dioxide, the two gases, and other substances. So polar molecules, the important thing is that they are repelled by the hydrophobic tails in the phospholipid bilayer. But non-polar molecules are not repelled because they have the same nature as the hydrophobic tails, which are non-polar. So oxygen and carbon dioxide, they are not repelled by the hydrophobic tails, so they can pass through the phospholipid bilayer easily. We'll discuss that further down. So for passive transport, there are three ways for substances to move into the cells without using any energy. First way is through the phospholipid bilayer itself, where the molecule can move through the gaps or the pores in between the phospholipid molecules, like this. So if it uses the first way, passing through the phospholipid bilayer, the type of transport is called simple diffusion. The second way is by using the transport proteins, namely the channel protein or the carrier protein. So for the channel protein, ions such as potassium ions will go through the canal or the channel in the protein, and as it passes through, it will cross the plasma membrane into the cell like this. So if it uses channel protein to pass into the cell, then the type of transport used is called facilitated diffusion, which we will study in the next video. The word facilitated means assisted diffusion, because it uses a channel protein to assist it to move across the plasma membrane. Now the third way is by using a carrier protein, which can change shape in order to allow the molecule to go into the cell. For example, glucose molecule, like this, changing shape, and then this allows the molecule to enter the cell. So there are three ways for substances to move into the cells. First way is through the phospholipid bilayer. Second way is by using channel protein. And the third way by using carrier protein. If it uses a channel protein or carrier protein, the type of transport is called facilitated diffusion, which we will study later in the next video. So this is an important point to note. What are the three factors that determine whether a molecule can pass through the plasma membrane? So we have to consider the polarity of the molecule. Is it polar with uneven distribution of charges, having positive ends and negative ends, or non-polar, not charged? So the non-polar molecules will find it easier to pass through the hydrophobic non-polar regions. Size of molecule, large or small? Small molecules will have an easier time crossing the phospholipid bilayer, as they can go through the pores. Large molecules probably have to use carrier proteins to help them cross the plasma membrane. Presence of ionic charges. For example, potassium has a positive charge, or magnesium with two positive charges. So these charged ions will find difficult to move past the hydrophobic regions, as we discussed just now. If they are not charged, then it is easier for them to pass through the hydrophobic regions. So we are going to look at some examples of the molecules and how they manage to get through the plasma membrane into the cell. So this schematic diagram is a very good diagram, complete diagram, that shows you the characteristics of substances that move across the plasma membrane and the reasons why they can move across the plasma membrane in different ways. So we can divide all the substances that move across the plasma membrane into two types: lipid-soluble substances that can dissolve in lipids, and lipid-insoluble substances that do not dissolve in lipids. Firstly, the lipid-soluble substances. So lipid-soluble substances are usually the non-polar substances that can dissolve in lipids. This includes glycerol, fatty acids, vitamins A, D, E, and K, steroids, and alcohols. So why can they move through the plasma membrane so easily? It's because they are lipid soluble and they can dissolve in the phospholipid bilayer, especially in the hydrophobic regions, which have similar properties to them. So they can move across it. Light dissolves light. So lipid soluble molecules are also hydrophobic and nonpolar, just like the hydrophobic regions in the phospholipid bilayer. So they will dissolve in the phospholipid bilayer, right? And then after that they can move across into the plasma, into the cell. Now the second type of substance are the lipid insoluble substances. So there are many types here. They are divided into the small molecules and ions and the larger molecules. For the small molecules or ions, we have the three types: nonpolar molecule, polar molecule, and charged ions. Non-polar molecules that are small include carbon dioxide and oxygen. So they will pass through the phospholipid, they will move through the phospholipid bilayer easily. Why? Because they are non-polar, just like the hydrophobic regions, and they are small in size. So they can move through the phospholipid bilayer very easily. So you have to know the reasons why they can move through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay? Now for polar molecules like water, they are small. So even though it's polar and the hydrophobic region will repel water, but because of its small size, it's H2O, it can move through the phospholipid bilayer very easily through the tiny pores and move into the cell. So that process where it diffuses from the region of higher concentration outside into the cell is called osmosis, which we'll study later. For charged ions like potassium, sodium, calcium, and chlorides, they are polar because they are charged. They are charged, and they cannot pass through the non-polar hydrophobic tails because of their charges. So they have to use the channel protein, as we have seen just now, the one with the pore or the canal, to move through it and then to go into the cells. They cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer itself. Now for larger molecules such as glucose and amino acids, they cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Some more they are polar molecules, right? So they use another type of transport protein called the carrier proteins, which can change shape to allow them to pass and move into the cells. So you must know all the reasons and also the types of molecules or ions, the different types, and how they move through the plasma membrane into the cell. So to summarize, let's discuss the movement of these substances across the plasma membrane again by using this diagram. For water, it can move through the phospholipid bilayer easily because it is small, right? Although it's polar, it's small. So it can easily go through the gaps here into the cell through the phospholipid bilayer. The name of the process, the diffusion of water, is called osmosis, right? The diffusion of water through a semi-permeable or selective permeable membrane. For non-polar molecules that are small like oxygen, there's no problem. There's no problem for them. They can easily move through the phospholipid bilayer through a process called simple diffusion, where they move from regions of higher concentrations to region of lower concentrations down the concentration gradient. Same too for the lipid soluble molecules like vitamin A, fatty acids, and glycerol. They also move through the phospholipid bilayer to get into the cells by simple diffusion. The process is called simple diffusion, and the method is they have to diffuse through the phospholipid bilayer. So all these are through the phospholipid bilayer for all these type of transport, and the name of the process is simple diffusion, and for water is osmosis. Now the second method is by using a channel protein, and this is used by the ions, the charged ions like calcium ions, potassium ions, magnesium ions, chloride ions. So all these ions, they cannot pass through the hydrophobic regions of the phospholipid bilayer because they are charged. Therefore, they will move through the channels or the canals of the channel protein to get into the cell. And the process that's involved is facilitated diffusion. Okay, as I said, facilitated means assisted, because there's the assistance of a channel protein to help them. Now, the third method, other than going through the phospholipid bilayer and through channel proteins, the other way to get into the cell to cross the plasma membrane is by using carrier proteins. So this is for large molecules like glucose. They will bind to the carrier protein, and the carrier protein will change shape to allow the glucose to enter the cell. So this type of movement is also called facilitated diffusion, like for channel protein, right? In all these cases, no energy is required for the movement, so it is a type. These are all types of passive transport, not active transport, right? Osmosis, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, they are all passive transport. We'll discuss this in more detail in the next video. That's all for this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll continue to discuss subtopic 3.2. It will be part 2, and we'll discuss the movement of substances across the plasma membrane through passive transport, that is through simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next video.